In the meantime, I'd like to let you know that we have interpretation into English and from English into Spanish and from Spanish. So if you require interpretation, please go to the globe at the bottom of your screen and click on the language you wish to listen to in interpretation.
Benefit from the translation, go to the bottom of the screen and click on the little globe and mark on the language on which you would like to hear the session. Vuelvo al español. Esta es la segunda sesión.
This is the second session of 4 on the topic of the agreements on data and material transfer. At this meeting, we will be talking about these agreements in practice, and the other sessions will address specific sessions, the roles, responsibilities, challenges, and the regulations that are still a pending task in most of our region. I'd like to remind you that we are hosting this session because one of the recommendations of the Pan American Health Organization's publications is to catalyze information in emergencies, ethical counseling, and the effects of the COVID-19 and the pending agenda. We identified this as one of the topics where we still felt there was greater need for training at the regional level. I'd like to share with you, for those of you who have not had access to it, the webpage of the Regional Bioethics Program. You have there the QR code as well for the webpage on the publication entitled Catalyzing Ethical Research During Emergencies. In addition to the general publication, we have an executive summary. We also have specific guidelines for ethics committees and for health authorities. And we also have a whole collection of slides that you can download and use if you wish to present and describe this publication. Finally, before introducing our expert for today, I'd like to remind you that the sessions are being recorded. And that you can receive the recording of the session if you register in the ethics investigation page on the regional bioethics program of Pan American Health Organization. Also, we will send you a direct link so that you can join through the chat. So without any further ado, I now would like to introduce Dr. Ana Solivier, and I'll switch to English now.
Apologies to our translators for so many changes. So Dr. Ana Solivier is the director of the Technology Transfer Office of the National Human Genome Research Institute, NHGRI, where she's been working for over 12 years. So in that capacity, she serves as the principal advisor to the Institute on all matters related to technology transfer, intellectual property, patenting, licensing, and she also engaged with industry and academia partners to set up the collaboration, the research collaborations and negotiate different agreements. And she also provides advice to scientists and negotiates licenses for technologies developed by the Institute, which is one of the different institutes of NIH. So I just want to say one final thing. So because Dr. Solivier is based in the US, she will use the US term for Research Ethics Committee, which is Institutional Review Board, IRB. You will see that in her slides. And I just wanted to remind you that every time you see the term IRB in her slides, that means what we know in the region as Research Ethics Committee. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Solovier, and I will start sharing your screen so you can your slides so you can start.
Great, thank you so much, Carla. Can you hear me okay? I hope someone let me know, if you can hear me. So thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me today, especially Carla and Sarah. Thank you everyone for attending the session. I hope it's useful today. There'll be plenty of time for questions. So as Carla said, my name is Anna Salovi. I work at the U.S. National Institutes of Health and one of its 27, believe it or not, institutes or centers, National Human Genome Research Institute. So I don't know if someone can pull up my slides that at least, oh, perfect. I see first slide. So this is just introductory. We'll set up, oh, perfect. Yeah, perfect. So of course I start with some disclaimers, I have to, so please understand that this presentation is just for educational purposes. This no statement shouldn't be construed as an official position. I'm not speaking for the government. This is not legal advice. And this presentation is not an endorsement by any of our agencies. So thank you. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start by explaining, and maybe you already know all of this, what's technology transfer, because I am from a technology transfer office, and you're going to hear this phrase a lot. So just as a little introduction, technology transfer is movement of information or data, of materials and technologies from the research laboratories, like here, NIH research laboratories, to either commercial companies or to academic groups. And we do this in order to support and promote further research to develop new products. You will see this term technology transfer used at universities also. Most research universities have some kind of a technology transfer office, but it can be called different things. So if you see something called strategic or industry alliances, licensing and patenting, maybe contracts, that can all be the same type of an office, and it can be at the US government, and also I'll talk about further, or at universities, public or private universities. Next slide, please. So at NIH, technology transfer is kind of spread out. As I said, we have 27 institutes or centers. So that's why we're called national institutes, if you notice, plural, institutes of health. Sometimes people say National Institute of Health. It's 27, so it's a lot of them. And our tech transfer, because we're so big, is spread out a little bit. So we have one central office of technology transfer, and they have somewhat limited role. They sort of are a service center to all the institutes. They oversee things like license royalty distributions and administrations. They enforce and monitor licenses. They market technologies, and I give you it's a very useful link to their website because it includes a lot of resources and template agreements. And then we have nine freestanding technology transfer offices at our institutes or centers. We call them ICs, institute or centers. And mine is one of them. So I am at the National Human Genome Research Institute, and our clients are only scientists at Genome. Some of the bigger institutes, like National Cancer Institute, are a service center. So they serve their own institute and a couple of others. And we pretty much do everything else. So we work with investigators on identifying patentable technologies and research tools. We work with law firms to actually prosecute patents. We negotiate various agreements, such as today we'll talk about MTAs and data transfer agreements, but a whole bunch of others also, a lot of collaboration agreements, and I'll have a list for you later. We market technology, we provide some advice on grants and conditional gift funds, and execute and negotiate licenses. And the link here below is also to the main technology transfer office, but there is a list of all different, we call TDCs, technology development coordinators. So if you're interested, you can see how many and who's the point of contact at each one of them. So just want to give you a little bit of an organizational structure, sort of where I'm coming from. Next slide, please. So without going into too much detail, because it looks like a very busy slide and a lot of legal language here, But again, to kind of give you a context of where technology transfer fits into, where these MTAs kind of fit into, I wanted to tell you a little bit of why we're even allowed to do technology transfer as a federal government agency. And it's based on you may have heard of it. For us, it's a very famous law, the Bayh-Dole Act. And, has a lot of numbers, but it's primarily known as the Bayh-Dole Act, because before this act, all inventions developed from federally funded research were owned by the federal government. So as you can imagine, it was inefficient. So if we funded universities and they had inventions, the government owned it. And as you can imagine, there was not enough resources to administer or prosecute patents or, really like do very much with the inventions. So under the Bayh-Dole Act, the first part of it was let universities who are grantees of NIH, they let them own, manage, and profit from inventions from federal funds. The government retains a research license. There are certain reporting procedures, and this allowed university tech transfer offices to be established. So most universities really all over the world have some type of a tech transfer office. And there is an organization, AUTM, AUTM. It used to be like spelled out, it used to be called University Technology Managed. AUTM, they only go for AUTM, University Technology Managers Organization. It's a very good website that will point you to some university resources. Next slide, please. So this first part of Bayh-Dole dealt a little bit with grantees, but then there was a follow-on act called the Stevenson-Waldler Technology Innovation Act. And now this applies to federal laboratories. So like I said, I work at NIH, but a lot of US federal government agencies have laboratories. So FDA, Food and Drug Administration, CDC, Centers for Disease Control, Veterans Administration, Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, all of them have labs. NASA has its own research program, obviously, and National Science Foundation. And we are all part of the Federal Laboratory Consortium, FLC. And again, I give you a link here. And this act actually allowed us to enter into CRADAs, and these are very specific collaborative agreements, cooperative research and development agreements with academic and private partners. We can license inventions, we can provide inventors with a share of royalties. So all of this established, it allowed us to form collaborations with academic, but also commercial partners. So that's these laws are very important for how we operate and what we do. So you can look it up for more information. I just wanted to give you a little introduction. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a little duplicative federal government technology transfer. There is a specific definition. It's similar to any other technology transfer. It is a process by which our knowledge, our facilities, capabilities developed with federal research are utilized to fulfill public and private needs. So again, tech transfer for us includes transfer from federal laboratories to partners and from partners to us. For us, generation of income is not as important like university. So we always like to emphasize that when you work with NIH, you get a great value because we really are more interested in really public good and public mission and commercialization, but not for profit. And we like to think that also promotes economic growth by partnering with local companies or small business groups. Could I have the next slide, please? So general big introduction to NIH. I'm sure you know. We like to say that we do research for the American people. We're part of a larger agency. Our agency is U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the Food and Drug Administration and Centers for Disease Control are part of it, but we're a separate agency. As I mentioned, we have 27 institutes and centers. So some of the larger ones you probably heard of: National Cancer Institute, NIAID, allergies and infectious diseases. We have diabetes, digestive and kidney diseases, a lot of different ones, mental health, neurological disorders, stroke, and NHGRI. I'm at NHGRI. It's one of the smaller and newer institutes, National Human Genome Research Institute. We have intramural and extramural components, as we call them. So intramural is in-facing, extramural is out-facing, meaning NIH is really known for its extramural activities, meaning grants. NIH gives out grants to universities all over the world. But intramural portion where I am are actually labs at NIH. These investigators are internally funded. And that's whom our clients are, and that's for whom I develop agreements and negotiate agreements. So I'm in the intramural part. We have a very large budget, and I, again, provide you links to NIH in general. And the second link, IRP, is intramural research program. So that's linked to all the labs that are at NIH in our intramural programs at all the institutes. Next slide, please. In addition to labs, we have a very big clinical center, which is basically a hospital where we carry out clinical trials. So we do these on our own. So we have a lot of clinical trials always ongoing. This is a cost-free care for enrolled patients. If you're enrolled in one of our trials, you don't need any health insurance. You don't need any authorization from your doctor. It's all covered if you are in the trial. And when we partner with companies or with universities, we can still carry out trials at our clinical center. So again, as we like to say, we provide good value. If you partner with us, we can actually carry it out without any insurance and cover a lot of overhead in the clinical center. Next slide, please. So NIH has a lot of functions. This is just a quick little overview. I think they are known, or we are most known for funding, meaning giving out grants. That the intramural component. We train scientists here. We have a small graduate student program, so we don't have students like universities, but we do provide training. There's basic research because at clinical trials, again, we can actually apply for patents and own inventions developed by our scientists, and we develop policies that are not only important for NIH, but for our grantees, such as a kind of a new data sharing policy. Next slide, please. And then within the tech transfer, we also interact. It's a busy slide here. We also interact with a lot of groups. So the TTO is in the middle there, in the green circle. And in order for us to negotiate the agreements and advise scientists, these are all the groups we have to interact with. So here's the IRB/bioethics. This is what Carla referred to, that group. And I think you'll be hearing, actually, I think you're hearing from someone from Bioethics group next week, next Tuesday. So I think Jeff Menser, has a good presentation coming. We interact with extramural groups, so universities, companies, Office of General Counsel. That's actually our primary attorney office. Some of us are attorneys. I'm an attorney, but the official advice, if there's something very controversial, has to come from OGC, Office of General Counsel. So I'm going clockwise. Ethics, not bioethics, but ethics. So for conflicts of interest, not related to human subjects research, we work with them. Procurement, which is for us buying, purchasing, basically. Federal government has very complicated purchasing rules, but sometimes those, sort of intersect with some of the material transfers or other things where things need to be paid for. Financial management branch, a central office of technology transfer. And again, on the outside, we interact with universities, patient organizations. In our institute, we work on a lot of rare diseases. So there are a lot of patient organizations interested in helping investigators or coordinating everything. Companies, and I mentioned FNIH here, that is Foundation for NIH. They are sort of affiliated with us, but not really. They're a little bit of an intermediary for certain gifts that come in. So they're not exactly part of us, but related foundation for NIH. Next slide, please. Again, busy slide here, but again, if you work with us and you've worked with universities in tech transfer, we're a little bit different. So it is similar, and those are our sister organizations at universities. But what we cannot do, because we're a government, we cannot create spin-off companies from our labs, and our investigators cannot work for private sector and the government. And university professors and faculty can. They can have their own companies, or they can work somewhere else, not us. We cannot take equity in lieu of money under any agreements. We are less flexible with legal terms. There are certain terms that, universities may agree to, but not us. And our scientists cannot serve as consultants or in any role with a company partner, except for an unpaid scientific advisory board, and has to go through a lot of clearances too. They cannot own stock in companies with whom they interact. So we have very strict conflict of interest rules about what our scientists can do. So, if you hear from university partners or tech transfer colleagues, the rules are just a little bit different. Next slide, please. So if you do partner with us, we call it partnering with our investigators, we can do it under a lot of different legal mechanisms, depending on what the interaction is. So We can do research collaboration agreement with a university or a nonprofit organization. Doesn't have to be a university or a company. We sign things like confidentiality agreement for discussions. Of course, a lot of, as we'll discuss today, both data transfer agreements and material transfer agreements. We also, as I mentioned, license our inventions, and we're licensed research tools. It doesn't have to be patented to be licensable. We do conduct clinical trial agreements, clinical trials. So we'll enter into agreement with a company to try their particular therapeutic. And a really kind of a unique research collaboration is a cooperative research and development agreement. Next slide, please. So getting to the MTA topic of today, actually, is we use MTA.
Sorry, Anna.
Yes.
And I think that it'll be helpful if you speak like a little bit slower for the interpreters to be able to catch everything. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Carla. Absolutely. I'll move you closer. Okay. Thank you. We use material transfer agreements to transfer materials, sometimes with data, to research institutions only. So I emphasize research here because if a material can be used for commercial purpose, this would require a license. So that's kind of the basic sort of threshold of a material transfer agreement. It's research purpose only. Commercial use, for us, it's something a little bit different. Next slide, please. We have, a lot of different types of MTAs. We don't use all of them at the same level, but as you can see, depending on the purpose, we have different templates. And a lot of our templates are on that Central Office of Technology Transfer website. And I have another link at the end for this. So if you wanted to look at some models, you could take a look. Standard MTAs, we call it. It is for non-human, non-animal materials. We are actually not required to use it for either receiving, so in or out, or outgoing materials. I'll go into a little bit why we would use it, but it's actually not required at NIH. For sort of non-human materials, it's optional. We have another template for transfer of organisms, so for animals, so usually whole animals. It's a little bit different. It's structured differently. It's recommended. It's not necessarily required, but we do advise to use it to record a transfer of an animal. And there is a separate documentation for veterinary health papers. Now, human materials those we always transfer under an MTA, at least out. We don't need it to receive materials, but we are required to use a template to transfer them out. And I'll go through our specific procedures in a little bit of detail. Human data, believe it or not, there isn't a centralized requirement for it yet, I think. At NHGRI, or genome, we call it for short, we use the same process as we do for human materials. So we always use a specific agreement that we developed for it. You may hear other terms, in English terms, SLA, UBMTA. SLA is a simple letter agreement. It's a very simple one-page document, for transfer. We rarely use them, maybe for incoming materials, but if we do want to use it, we want something more detailed. And UBMTA, we also use really only for incoming materials. So if the provider wants to use it, we will use it. And I think, next slide, please. I think I have UBMTA. Oh, not yet. UBMTA will come later. So going back to the standard MTAs, as I mentioned, they are not required to be used, but we recommend them. So if a scientist comes to us and says, I want to send some mouse samples, so mouse, not human, not a whole animal, just some tissue, should I use it or not? And then we say, well, it depends. We would recommend it if you want to do a few things. If you want to restrict use of these materials only in a particular recipient's laboratory. So if you don't want them to send it anywhere else, probably a good idea. If you want to restrict the use to a specific research project, so these are some proprietary tissues, so they were treated with something, you want only one specific use, we can put it in the MTA. MTA will include standard acknowledgement provisions in publications. I mean, that's a standard scientific norm, but maybe you want to write it down, like, please make sure you acknowledge I provided this. and just have a record of the transfer. So it kind of depends on how proprietary the material is, how important it is to the scientists. So for most part, we use these for, as I said, mouse samples, maybe dog samples, depending which animal you work with, but not a whole animal, just tissues. Plasmids, which these days more common, people transfer them without agreements, maybe antibodies. So that's where we would use a standard MTA, but again, not required. That's a situation specific, depending on what the investigator needs or how they feel about their materials. Next slide, please. I mentioned UBMTA. That's a very interesting agreement. This stands for Uniform Biological Material Transfer Agreement. It is more complex than just a simple letter agreement. But again, as with all the MTAs that we're discussing today, it's for research use only. It is pre-negotiated. So many years ago, a lot of organizations sort of came up with this template. It's actually pretty long and complicated if you look at it, but it was pre-negotiated, and a lot of organizations, international organizations, have signed up to it. So they said, we will use it. So if your organization has signed for it, you can find them on, again, autumn.net, Association of University Technology Managers. And if you Google it, I didn't give you the whole link because it's very long, but if you go on Autumn and you search for UBMTA, you will get both the master agreement, you can look at the whole copy, implementing letter. So if you do say, yes, I will, so we only accept materials under this. We don't use it to send it out because the terms are not exactly what we need actually, but to actually execute it, all you do is you sign an implementing letter, and it's understood that it goes with the master agreement. So, and then the list of signatories is also very long. So you can search and you can say, okay, this organization signed the UBMTA. If we send them an implementing letter because we're sending them materials, they should be able to sign. They're authorized to sign that. So UBMTA is another term you probably will see. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have a separate template for transfer of organisms, or either whole live animals, maybe the frozen embryos of animals, maybe it's frozen sperm, mostly mice, at least in our case. We have a zebrafish facility also, so that would qualify. And our template is based on a description of an allele. So it says, a mouse whose gene X been modified. So it's a slightly different template, not standard, not human, but we have a template. And again, that should be available on our main technology transfer office website. Next slide, please. So human materials, where we really, what we really spend most time on and are very detailed and are very careful about is when we send human materials, because, they were collected from patients at NIH. We want to make sure that they're good. We are good stewards of those samples, and we follow, patient consents and patient wishes as well. So NIH has a very specific policy for sharing of human materials collected at NIH under our protocol. And I cite here a chapter. I think this is a public chapter that you could look up. And I say it was a new policy. Well, it came into effect in 2010, so not so new anymore. And again, as with all the other MTAs, I emphasize one more time, we're just talking research use. We're not talking about companies using these to make a product. So this policy states that we must really abide by the highest scientific and ethical standards to preserve the public's trust and the substantial investment these resources represent. So it does not apply if our clinicians want to send it to labs on a fee-for-service basis or diagnostic purposes. So if we're paying someone, if it's an actual clinical sample and it has to be, a diagnosis has to be made, you send it to a company to run an assay and pay for it, this doesn't apply to it. This is research purposes only. So it's not so much clinical use or, diagnosing a patient, it's really, research. So under the policy, a written agreement must be used, preferably an MTA. So NIH has a template agreement that's generally used by all the ICs. Next slide, please. this is, sorry, very small letters here, but again, this is continuing the policy of sending, sharing, transferring human materials. So materials should be distributed in a fair manner and without bias to qualified recipients for research purposes, but taking into account limited quantities. So, if we have materials from patients with a rare disease and there aren't too many, sometimes we cannot share them. Sometimes the clinician will say, I barely have any to do a little bit of work here, I cannot share it. So we try, and we want to share materials as much as possible, but we have to take into account, especially with human samples, that there are limited quantities. Again, generally NIH requires that human materials be transferred only after an appropriate bioethical approval. And I'll go into detail of how we do it here at NAGRI. So again, I put two terms here, IRB, which Carla mentioned is a specific term, and bioethics is a group, is more of a larger group. They deal with IRB issues, but even more than that. Now, interestingly enough, for incoming materials, we don't have a policy that requires an MTA. It's up to the provider. So in any case with an MTA, it's really the provider who should decide, do I want an MTA or not? Because MTA restricts use in a specific way. So it's really the provider who always decides, I want it or I don't want it. So we actually don't need an MTA for incoming human materials, although if an investigator is receiving it, there's a separate requirement. There's a separate Office of Human Subject Research protocol who will decide, like, do they need a clearance? Do they need a waiver or something else? So our office is not involved with that for incoming materials. But there is an office at NIH that the investigator has to contact and say, I have human materials incoming. Like, what clearance do I need? So MTAs are generally a one-way transfer. You send the materials, maybe you get the results back, kind of informally, you'll show the results back, but it's kind of a one-way transfer. If we're doing an entire collaboration, so you'll be going back and forth with analysis and talking about the project, maybe there'll be more than one instance of sharing, then maybe a combination of agreements or a collaboration agreement is appropriate. So again, MTA, it's kind of a one-way transfer without too much more. But if it's a collaboration, then we can talk about something a little bit more complex. Next slide, please. So what do we do specifically at Genome? What happens when an investigator wants to transfer human material? So they will contact our office and they'll say, we have these samples. Now they have to be collected at NIH. It's not for samples that you bought from a repository or you got from somewhere else. You have to collect them here and under an NIH protocol. And the use has to be research purpose. So usually university. So NAGRI will need the following information for our template. So we actually require rather specific description of the sample. So we know, in the future, we can refer to it. So we'll say, what's the type of tissue, from how many patients, do the patients have a specific disorder or disease? Sometimes the investigators send us code. So, they code the samples and they tell us which code. It's not required, but sometimes it's good to have. And we have a clinical protocol number, so we also refer to it. What we need is also a description of a research purpose or plan of the recipient. We need to know whether any PII, so personally identifiable information, or key, if it's coded to personally identifiable information, be sent. And it usually isn't. 99% of the instances, no PII is shared. Once it's shared, it's a little bit more tricky, but usually not. And one thing that we require that not all institutes do are blank copies of the consent versions signed by the donors. Because again, we do want to follow the wishes of the patients, in making these transfers. Next slide, please. So once we set up the MTA, we use a template, use all this information, and the first place it goes to is actually our bioethics or IRB team. Again, I use it interchangeably because there is a slightly different organization. We reorganized our IRB recently, so but there's a group at NAGRI that's bioethics that helps us with this review. They will review the types of samples, the transfer, the goal of the research, and they will compare it to the protocol and consent under which those samples were collected. So they have access to all the protocol information and the clinical database. Most of the time, this is fine. They approve it. They say we review it. It appears to be consistent with all the documentation, but not always. Sometimes the donors need to be reconsented. Maybe we have a very old consent form, and language has changed, or we never anticipated this kind of use many years ago. Maybe they have to sign a new consent version. Maybe there's some kind of a conflict of interest. So all of that needs to be determined. And I believe that next week you will hear a little bit more about consent forms and what's in there, what the review needs to take into account. So this bioethics IRB piece is specific to NHGRI. Not all institutes use it. We do because we really want to be careful about how we send the materials and making sure we're allowed to do this. What all the ICs use is an attestation. So NIH investigators also sign an attestation form stating, yes, the consents allow for it and protocol allows for it. So in a way, they say that I have reviewed it and I am attesting right here by signing this, that this is all allowed. So we do this double check at NHGRI by asking bioethics and independent, someone who's a little bit more independent, to say, please also review the consents and the protocol and let us know if this proposed use is in line with what's in those documents. So we do a little bit of extra work, but we think it's worth it to be very careful with human samples. Next slide, please. So what's the volume? We go through this pretty process. We have a small IC as NHGRI. Our office is actually 5 people. We were 4 for a long time. We're finally back to 5. We support about 40 labs altogether. And some of them, are busier than others. So right now, this detailed process works well for us. It's a bit of work, but it also gives us confidence that both NIH policies are being followed and patient wishes. So, we like to have this. So note, we just actually finished our 2023 fiscal year, but in previous year, we have about 120 human MTAs and 58 information transfer agreements. So it is a lot, but it's a good process. And we think, we think it's worth it. We think it's worth, doing all the detailed work here. Next slide, please. So what happens, once bioethics approves and we send the MTA to the recipient? Sometimes this goes really fast. Sometimes it takes time. So just, be prepared. We prepare our investigators. It kind of depends who the recipient is, how strict they are about the terms, because our MTA is a standard template, but it includes maybe some terms, especially if it's going maybe to a different country and they have different requirements, so it kind of depends. So all I'm saying is sometimes it takes some time to negotiate the terms. It's not that most recipients will just sign. Some of them, so we may go back and forth and say, no, we don't want this, so we want a different law to apply. So it may take a little bit of time. So we do want our investigators to be a little patient, and sometimes it's not up to us as to what the recipient can actually agree to. Another important piece is who signs the document. So this will depend on your institution. For the most part, at NHGRI, for outgoing human MTAs, we need 2 signatories. One is either our clinical director or a scientific director and a tech transfer director. And believe it, not the PI. And people may find it shocking. PIs can sign as read and understood, meaning they understand this, these are the terms, but who's actually agreeing to the legal terms is the institution. In a way, this shields the investigator from liability. And same for the recipient. I think we put in our template something like, please confirm who is authorized to sign this document. Otherwise, it's not valid or enforceable. So again, it's not usually the PI. Maybe it's the head of the department, maybe, but usually the recipient has a tech transfer or legal or contract or some kind of an authorized signatory who is not usually the PI. So some people find it surprising that, the investigators themselves just don't sign everything, but it's good. It shields them from liability. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits? We spoke about it a little bit, but so why do we bother going through this whole process of checking things and back and forth and emails and documents? All of that seems like a lot of work. But we do think that for human MTA, it's very important because it protects the owner. So the provider, like NIH, owns the samples once we collect them, but also the donor. This is a systematic way of tracking human samples. We have some programs that need to account for the amount of samples they collected. Where are they? How many do we have left? So this helps the investigators and us track. We make sure that it's not shared with others for different purpose. So the MTA will say, you can only use it in your lab, only for this purpose. You can't share it with another lab at your university, for example, and you cannot send it outside, to a company. There is language that says the donor should not be re-identified or contacted, so we don't send any personally identifiable information, and we don't want the donors to be contacted. It shields the NIH and individual PI from liability. So again, individual PI that is not the authorized signatory, and it includes terms that will really, protects the NIH. It has sets out standard publication and acknowledgement terms, and makes sure that recipient follows all the applicable laws and regulations related to their handling of human data. So again, there is language that says, you should follow specific, your own, whether it's IRB or another regulation or another office, but they're required to sign saying, we will follow what's applicable to us. Next slide, please. One other thing I want to address is as you saw from us, for us, it's sort of a manual process, case by case. Investigator emails us, we email back, we discuss. Some offices use an automated process. So maybe there is a database, like an online process. Sometimes the investigators, rather than emailing us, they'll say, go on to online, they submit and, route MTAs. Because we're somewhat small, and we, have good relationship with investigators, we like to be more involved, because sometimes, through a sort of a routing process, you miss something or you don't get all the information and you have to email them anyway to ask. So we don't use it, but that's not to say that's not a good idea, because some places do have like databases set up for this purpose. The investigators have access and they can automatically enter it and it gets forwarded. So while I say we don't use it, we actually have one clinical program that has a database to track their samples for this particular clinical program. And they do send us requests for MTAs from there. But it's a little bit different because we still follow up with them and discuss with them. And it's really for them, not for us. We have a separate database to track all the tech transfer agreements. But that's one idea, like making it a little bit more automated, especially if the volume is large. So that may help an office work more efficiently. Next slide, please. So far we talked about material transfers and sharing human materials, but we also share human data. These days, especially sequencing data, people share it, people, analyze it in different ways. So we do share a lot of human sequencing data. Here at NIH, the procedures vary by institute because, again, there is no central requirement for this. We actually at NHGRI use the same procedures as for human materials. We thought, better be safe. You already have the process in place. Why not just use it? So it's almost the same. Again, we have a written agreement. It's reviewed by bioethics in view of the protocol and consent forms. As I mentioned, this transfer usually involves human exome or genome sequencing data. Sometimes this is in the context of a consortium, or maybe a consortia are exchanging information. Sometimes it's sort of a consortium agreement for sharing data. And again, there are restrictions, sometimes there may be a committee to review publications, restrictions of further data sharing. And the reason we do use agreements is because there is still a danger of donor identification. And also this is an efficient way of tracking transfer news, but the identification is especially problematic. Next slide, please. So similarly to the material transfers, the data we share is de-identified. We try to, not share any PII, as we call it, personally identifiable information with the data. But as you know, in this day and age, it is easy and possible to re-identify individuals. And in fact, we started using these agreements because an investigator did come to us and said, I want to share this data and it's going to be de-identified, but I'm so worried that it's so easy to like re-identify. You can go online. There's so many things available. Some of these, companies that, will track your like genetic information, your ancestry. Some of these ancestry, companies, have so much data. And you can, if you're savvy and you know your bioinformatics, you could do it. So we said, okay, we'll put something in writing. So at least we write down that you're not supposed to do that. I mean, if you do, there's so much we can stop you, but at least we put it in writing. Like you're getting this de-identified, you're not supposed to go back and identify donors. So for us, that's really the key concern, as well as secure transmittal and storage. So, they don't just store it anywhere. So we do have a default language for transferring it on encrypted hard drive or via secure email. And we have some restrictions on actual storage. So, which is similar for the human material. So we follow sort of parallel process. Next slide, please. So data transfer agreements, you're going to see a number of different, names also. I don't think there's a standardized name, like MTA is a little bit more standard in English, but, data use agreements, maybe data use and sharing agreements. We actually use our own template called information transfer agreement, because sometimes we share other things than sort of human data. We shared code under this. So, you'll see many different things. Sometimes you'll see a memorandum of understanding if there's maybe a consortium set up, but within there are data sharing provisions. So the nomenclature isn't really, like very consistent, but, it's pretty easy to identify. Next slide, please. So here I'm a little bit more length, and and I think the organizers will let you know. I think the slides will be available, or this is also being recorded. So where can you find sort of a little bit more information or specific templates? So our main tech transfer office, NIH Office of Tech Transfer, has a website, and if you go there, there is a separate tab for resources, and there will be forms, many different ones, between MTAs, license forms, CRADAs. You can find different template agreements. If you want to collaborate with the investigators, our intramural research program is the second link, IRP, Intramural Research Program, that will guide you to all different labs and all different institutes. You could search within each institute, and there are 27 of them, depending on different focus. And also one place where you can kind of see who's doing what, which investigators do what research, is the reporter. So that's a public database that's easy to navigate. It's a research portfolio for anyone who's gotten any NIH funding, whether it's within NIH, outside. That's sometimes very useful to use as well. Next slide, please. And that's pretty much it. That's all the kind of simple MTA information I have for you today. As I mentioned, my office has 5 colleagues. We are located in Bethesda, in the state of Maryland, in the United States. We work both in person and remotely. I am teleworking today, but I'm going to the office tomorrow. I'm the director of the small office, and we have our own website. Genome.gov is just NHGRI's main website, and there's a link to our office specific link. So thank you so much for listening up to this point. I think now there will be a Q&A, question answer, maybe some panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's been great to hear your presentation and learn from the experience of NHGRI handling MTAs. I think we can hardly think of an institution with more complex experience on the topic. So, colleagues, what we will do now is that we will have 2 discussants, and after the discussants share their comments, we will go back to Dr. Solivier, and then we will have a broader discussion. And so please share your questions in the Q&A as you're already doing it. And I see some of you are writing your questions in the chat, and it really be helpful if you could include them in the Q&A instead. So I'm gonna switch languages now. Es un gran gusto para mí.
It's a great pleasure for me to present Dr. Carlos Berger. He is an attorney, doctor in legal sciences, and he's a specialist in bioethics and the ethics of research. And he is the coordinator for the Committee on Central Ethics of the province of Buenos Aires. Carlos, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we want to hear your views from the perspective of Argentina and the region about this session presentation. Thank you very much, Carla. Thank you very much to all. The truth is that after the doctor's presentation, I have nothing left to do other than congratulate her for the outstanding work being done. It's very difficult in our region to have now an office such as your Office of Transfer of Technology, which is really, we're quite jealous of you. It's so wonderful you have such an organization. And I think the doctor's been very clear in speaking about something that of particular interest to me, which is the relationship between the ethical concepts and the legal concepts. Why? Because through the MTAs and the DTAs, we can see how everything that is assured or guaranteed, rights, protection of the patient, of the sample donor, the one that is handling the data, becomes later on a legal agreement. So to a certain extent, we could say that what the ethics committees have suggested as an ethical recommendation ends up becoming mandatory in an agreement. And I think that's very important to highlight. And it's part of what we need to do with our ethics committees and in our own local regulations. Because in Argentina, we also have legal problems with terms that have not yet been agreed on or incorporated. So what is Argentina's situation? Let me describe it. In 2012, we had the first census of the Biobank Committee at the National Ministry, and it was a census of 11 biobanks in the country. At that time, we didn't yet have any regulations, and most of these were in public centers. And that's important to keep in mind, because I think that the application of the MTAs in these possible biobanks would be a tool that would democratize knowledge. For instance, as the doctor said, since NIH is works for public health and that researches topics that affect the population, it's one more proof of the value of having biological samples and reaching agreement on how to handle them. But as I said, in Argentina, we had no rules. The first biobanks that were created used as a reference in 2016, the last version of the Zion guidelines, where they include the concept of MTA for the transfer of human samples, but we still had no standard on it. Then in 2020, when there was a resolution adopted by the Ministry of Health of the nation, Resolution 2940, then we finally established the need to have MTAs, which in turn had to be assessed by the ethics committee associated with the biobank or the research project involved. This obviously means that we at the regional level, as the doctor said, need to now try to harmonize the terms of all our MTAs, particularly if there is going to be an international transfer of samples. respecting on the one hand ethical principles, but on the other hand, the different rules or laws that exist in the region, which make things more difficult. But if we work on that through the Pan American Health Organization, through these various organizations, we may be able to reach and come up with a standardized form for the region. Now, what I have are some questions for Dr. Solowich. First is, have you registered the language of the MTAs? In other words, or non-compliance? Have you found cases where there's no compliance of the clauses in the MTA? And do you think if in the event the non-compliance occurs, would there be an intervention or is there a complication presented to the ethics committee about that? And then I have two other questions. You said, doctor, that in the case of data transfer, it was recommendable but not mandatory to have an agreement. Do you think, doctor, that it would be advisable to have standards in the region that make it mandatory that data transfer agreements be mandatory in all cases? And finally, something that you covered in your presentation, which has to do with the handling of data. When you talked about the limitations in the data transfer, to make sure that these data are not identifiable. In today's world, on the basis of new technology that exists, such as artificial intelligence and data agencies, how could we come up with a really non-identifiable data that would allow for the proper transfer of the data? That's all for the moment. Again, my congratulations to Dr. Solovich. I think she has given a brilliant presentation, and particularly what I've referred to in her, she has been able in her office to link ethical issues with the exercise of a legal practice, such as the data and MTA agreements that we've talked about. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carlos. And before I call on Ana, I'd like to introduce Sara Carracedo of the Regional Bioethics Program of Pan American Health Organization, who's a bioethicist and attorney as well, so that she can also make some comments from the regional perspective. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Ana and Carlos, for joining us today. Ana, thank you so much for your presentation, because I believe it illustrates the idea that's ever present in the region, and that is that transfer agreements are some sort of unilateral document that the researcher signs off on, or that are the responsibility of the sponsor, but they are not institutional in nature. The approach in these agreements does not tend to focus on the institutional aspect. And I believe that this is one of the shortcomings, like Carlos said, in several countries in the region. So I believe your presentation illustrated very clearly that in order to ensure that these exchange and transfer processes happen ethically and that align to applicable regulatory frameworks, we need to have a technology transfer office in place that will more likely than not have to be adjusted according to the institution, but that it is also an office that doesn't do just legal aspects only, but rather is in contact with the ethics unit, like the ethics committees or a bioethics unit, like the ones you have at the NIH. So it teaches us that these offices are not just developing agreements in a void, but rather they are in charge of being in contact with researchers and have this institutional responsibility. And that is that these agreements are implemented appropriately so that they can ultimately ensure that the data and the samples are used pursuant to the donor's wishes. Because working with samples involves joint effort, and this was very clear in your presentation. And like you said, this is still part of the unfinished business that some of the institutions in the countries have. That is to say, we are yet to create these offices, or at least make the work that these offices do more formal, so we can carry out these processes to ensure that these transfer agreements are done as accurately as possible. But today we learned something else, and that is that there's different types of agreements according to the material or the data that will be transferred, and that each agreement has not only their own legal considerations, but also ethical considerations for use. In some cases, they depend on the provider's policies, but in some other cases, it will depend on the information that's being transferred. So there's no silver bullet for, transfer agreements. And I believe it's very important to take into account this concept when we are developing and planning how these agreements will be drafted and later on implemented. I believe this is it for my overall comments. And just like Carlos, my question focuses on compliance of these agreements, given that the purpose is to ensure that the data or samples are used pursuant to the donor's wishes. My question is, how do you make sure that the agreement is complied with in the receiving institution? So this responsibility does this lie in the beneficiaries or receiving institution, or does the provider have any kind of power if some sort of non-compliance is identified? So this is one of the questions that came to mind, just like Carlos. I think that's it. And I hope we have a very productive session with our participants' questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm going to pass the baton to you, Anna.
Okay, so I think it's up to me to answer some questions, and I think I wrote them down because otherwise, it's but I think so. Actually, the first question from Carlos and Sarah, I think, is very similar. So it's about compliance, about enforcement of the agreements, really. And I hate to say it, but there's only so much we can do once the agreement is signed and the samples are sent. It's a little bit, have we seen non-compliance? We haven't really seen anything egregious where someone has shared the samples without our knowledge, or how would we find out about it? Sometimes by accident, maybe there's an inappropriate publication, and in publication we find out. So I think for the most part, we trust our recipients. How would we enforce it? And our attorneys are the Department of Justice. So if something bad happens, we want to sue somebody, it would have to be, believe it or not, the attorneys at the Department of Justice, and they would only go after probably really big cases. So in some ways, these agreements are a little bit a word of honor. It's an academic understanding, because they are for research purposes. They are between academic institutions who are all doing research. So there has to be a level of trust. We sign it, their authorized signatories sign it. And if the scientist does something else and doesn't follow it, maybe we find out, maybe we don't find out. We haven't had a problem so far. And in fact, but I will say, the reason the whole policy about human materials came into place, because people did get in trouble. Before we signed agreements, their samples weren't tracked. And I think there was a trouble. Some scientists took it to a company without telling anybody. And then there was a big discussion, and believe it or not, US Congress got involved. So it all started because US Congress had some hearings because there was no way of tracking. But since this happened, since we've had the agreements in place, there have been less problems. Like our individual institute hasn't had a problem. Sometimes they can be resolved informally because, again, it's between two scientists, two universities. So someone may contact us saying, oh, I'm thinking of sharing it with somebody. For the most part, people contact us and say, I have it, I want to share it. What do I do? And then we sign another agreement. So it has been pretty amicable. But if something really dangerous happened, you know, there are actually limited ways in which we can pursue it. And again, our lawyers are Department of Justice, and would they pursue it? So it's a little bit of an honorable agreement too, in addition to signing it, really, because, you know, and so far it's been working. So far it has been working. So I think that was the first question. It's maybe, then the second one was, do we think there actually is a need for standard data sharing agreement? You know, as I said, there isn't a policy right now, or there isn't a mandate at NIH. I don't know why exactly, because maybe because the MTA policy came in place such a long time ago, where sequencing, it wasn't so fast to sequence human data. It wasn't so easy. It's getting less expensive. And in 2010, maybe people weren't anticipating it so much. But now, I mean, these machines are so fast, and we can do it like, you know, for individual patients now. So I think it's a little bit up to each individual tech transfer office to decide. And we decided it's just as important to put something in place for data as for materials. I'm not really sure why there hasn't been sort of mandatory at NIH, but I think most of us, if not all of tech transfer offices, do it because, yeah, it's just as important for data as it is for materials, because I don't think it's possible to provide the kind of data that can never be identified, you know, which was another question. Yeah, you know, as Carlos mentioned, between all the AI and all the data available out there, and especially, you know, look at those heredity or ancestry databases that collect from so many people, and they have it. And, you know, police have used it, right? Police have used like data from those ancestry groups to identify like a criminal, you know, so yeah, so I don't think, so in some ways in the future, it's always going to be a little bit of, you sign the agreement and then there's trust. So you're sharing it for research purpose with an investigator to do research. We're not sharing it so you can sell it or develop a product. That's a license. Licensing is a whole different story. We actually cannot license data at NIH. Universities, I think, can license data, but not the government, by the way. So for commercial purposes, it's different, I think. For research purposes, I think it's a collegial, it's always a collegial relationship, I think, on top of having these legal agreements. So I think that's what I wrote down, but if there's follow-up, I'm happy to discuss.
I'm gonna ask if I seem to recall that Carlos had a question that sort of fell through a crack. Carlos, no sé si estoy en lo correcto.
Carlos, am I right that there was a question that has not been answered, or do you have any follow-up questions? And the same for Sarah. Please let me know, and we can go back. If that's the case, go ahead, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Carla, the doctor, has answered all the questions I had. And one of the topics I'm interested in is something the doctor mentioned when she said that she doesn't understand why they are not required. They should be required. So my question has to do with whether it would be advisable for us to come up with standards in the region, in different states, so that these agreements are required by law, and to have this become part of all the applicable laws that govern health matters. But the doctor answered this already. She said, I don't know why it's not required, but it's a good practice to require these agreements whenever we handle data. Oh, and I have another question. I just remembered. How could we define non-identifiable data? Because the doctor mentioned that when we deal with identifiable data, there are, of course, certain restrictions on transfer. So how we identify non-re-identifiable data, taking into account, like I said, all of the existing types of technologies. That is to say, how does NIH conclude that certain data could be transferred because it's not identifiable? I don't know if my question is making sense. Especially because the doctor herself, during her presentation, said, well, a researcher tells me this is not re-identifiable data. But again, with all the technology available, it could become identifiable. So how do we conclude that any piece of data is 100% non-identifiable? If it's possible, right? Or whether we should just, from the get-go, talk about restricting its use.
Agregar solamente una
I
cuestión.
wanted to add one more thing that Carlos kind of mentioned. And it has to do with this idea that we sometimes have that regulating something means that everything would work wonderfully. And that's not always the case. A piece of, regulation will help to a certain extent, and when it addresses what ethically should be done during research. But in these cases, sometimes the best option is not always to hyper-regulate, but rather to promote that trust that Anna was mentioning during her response. For example, how do we ensure that these MTAs are actually complied with in practice? So again, work on trust building between the scientific community, sample donors, institutions, etc., and just to promote or advocate for best practices in this, to educate our people and get training on this, to help build this trust. This was my comment. Apologies. Carla, one more thing to supplement what Sarah just said. I wasn't saying that regulating will be a silver bullet, but from what the doctor said, to make agreements mandatory. That's what I was saying. And then, like Sarah said, the terms will depend on each case, the type of project we're talking about, but in terms of MTAs, since they're not required, I wonder whether we should advocate for making them mandatory. That was my comment, requiring some sort of agreement.
Thank you. So going back to the first question about identifiable, de-identifiable data, very complicated. When we send our data, say sequencing data, the best we can do is not provide any information about the donor. So we'll say, we're looking, you're sending it to someone to do some analysis and see, is there a mutation here? Is there a mutation there? But not providing, is it, who the patient is, unless you have to, maybe you have to say it's a rare disease. We're looking for mutation in this general area. But otherwise, the gender, the date of birth, we try to strip away anything that we know about the patient, name, anything like that. But I don't think it's entirely possible to make it so anonymous that no one could ever figure it out. You have a sequencing data, if it's whole genome sequencing data, you can figure out, male or female. You have access to all kinds of publication and things that you could do. So we can strip away as much as possible, but to make it, all your life information is right in that code. So it would be difficult to say. So that's why that level of trust comes in. We say, you're signing this document by saying you're not going to go back and look. it's also important. I think in addition, as we talk about building trust, telling people why it's so important. It's kind of easy to identify someone or whatnot. It's so important, like as stewards and scientists and investigators, to have your own code. It's kind of your own code of ethics as an investigator, to follow, not just to, you sign the agreement, you understand it's important, but, so I don't think it's possible to provide super anonymized data, like zero. We do it as much as we can, but sometimes it's necessary. It's a rare disease. We're kind of looking in this area. We have to, tell them something for the analysis. And again, this balance between regulation, requiring MTAs, and educating, I mean, everyone in the field is very smart, very smart people. So, they'll understand if you tell them more, like why it's important, on top of, signing the agreement. Like it really matters. It's not just paperwork. Lots of paper. It's, some people think it's not that important to sign a lot of paper, but there are these ethical obligations as a researcher, as a scientist, to yourself and to the patient. So yeah, so there has to be that trust, because it goes out there. We let go of control. And even though something is signed, there's so much, we know the police, like there's only so much we can do about it. But it is important to, have a policy in place and tell people why we're doing it. It's important. We're going to try to make it as easy as possible. Like I said, there's a UBMTA for materials, which is an international big pre-negotiated agreement, something like that for data. There might actually be something in the works about data too, now that I think about it, but not off the top of my head. So anyway, I hope that answers some of it, a little bit, questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. We have so many questions. I'm just trying to weave them in a way that make the conversation flow in the best way. So someone was asking about cybersecurity provisions, whether the MTAs do say something about that and what that would be.
So the data transfer agreement, we have a standard language that says you will transfer it via secure email or encrypted hard drive, or if our investigators have another method, there's something called Globus or something like they have. So we definitely put in there how you're going to transfer the data, because it's going to be a lot of data. You can't just, even though it's de-identified, it's still sensitive information. So we put something in there, and we can be flexible as long as it's secure. Maybe with the email with a password, it's okay. So we kind of ask the investigators, what do you use? What's easiest to use? And we'll put it in there, but at least we'll put in there, definitely transfer it in some secure way.
Thank you. That's also interesting and makes me think about our next session, when we will dive into the different roles and what does the investigator do? What does the ethics committee do? And there's another question that's related to this more procedural aspects. So do you use digital certified signatures for MTAs?
So we use a variety of signatures. We accept almost any signature. There are still places out there, not us, who want an ink, who want like a piece of paper signed and mail. Believe it or not, every now and then we ask, like, mail us this piece of paper. So we don't require that. We will take DocuSign. DocuSign is a kind of a common software now. We do that. We use mostly Adobe. We use Adobe and PDF documents, and we can use we actually have a specific ID card we put in and sign. Honestly, if nothing else works, I will sign, scan it in, and send that. So we'll accept almost anything. I mean, we're not very particular about it, as long as it looks, the correct person signed it. It's really who the person is. So we'll accept the variety. But I do know there are some places that will, and we don't need that need like this, in their hand. So we'll accept, anything kind of similar.
Thank you. There's a question, someone's asking for clarification because when you present the NHGRI process for human MTAs, you refer to the to the basic, the general NIH template, and that includes blank copies of the consent version signed by the donors. So they wanted, one of the attendees wanted to know, what do you mean by those by a blank copy of the consent?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's a NHGRI specific piece. So the MTA template is NIH specific. All the institutes use pretty much the same template, and that's the MTA. And then the investigator signs an attestation. That's also NIH common process. The additional piece, the consent forms and working with bioethics, is genome specific. Maybe other ICs do it, but I'm not sure. So when we're dealing with human samples, when we ask the investigator, our protocols and consents undergo a lot of amendments. So when an IRB approves a consent form, believe it or not, maybe 2 weeks later, there's a change. And 2 months later, there's a change. And maybe they add something else, or maybe the study changes. So one protocol could have like 10 different versions of consent forms. So when we ask the investigators, we say, for these samples, which one of these versions did the donor sign, and send it to us to tell to bioethics, but blank. We don't want to see, the patient's name on it or like sign, just a form, like whatever form, because, there are 10 versions. Which one of the 10 versions did these particular donors sign? Because that's more specific, because as they change, there may be language that's been added or subtracted or something. So then the bioethics will say these samples match these consents, and they have access to the protocol. So that's our kind of specific, and our investigators are used to it, and it shouldn't be hard for them to get if they keep good records to say these donors signed the consent that's brand new, like number 10, that's the one we're going to send you. So that's what we ask for.
Muchas gracias, Ana. Esta es una perfecta transición.
Thank you, Anna. This is a perfect transition to a question on something you mentioned. You referred to the IRB, the Committee on Research Ethics, and you've also referred to a bioethics department, which at NIH is a department of bioethics experts. So what's the difference in their jobs or tasks? What goes to the IRB, which is a central committee at NIH, and what goes to the Department of Bioethics, to the bioethics experts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a very good question. So, and we've had a little bit of reorganization of IRB at NIH recently. So many years ago, there were a few IRBs handling different institutes, but now, as you mentioned, Carl, there's one central IRB. And we actually don't work with them very much. Our office doesn't work. From my understanding, this is the one office that actually approves clinical protocols. So if an investigator wants to start a clinical protocol and have the protocol approved and all the consents approved, there is a process and there's all kinds of scientific review, and that goes to the IRB. And that central group will meet, they'll discuss with investigators, but they will provide approval. Like this clinical study, as is written well, it's okay to proceed, the patients are okay to sign these forms. And I think that's the main function. There may be others, but it's very clinically specific process. And that's who makes those decisions for NIH investigators. They sign the number and do all this procedural stuff. And then bioethics, different institutes, I think, have different groups. So we at Genome have our own NHGRI bioethics. We call it a core. It's a team. There may be a central bioethics group that I'm not sure, but we have a group of people, and I hope we're going to hear from one of them next week. Also, Jeff can explain it even better next week. And they, I think, they help investigators write these. I think they have people who, if you have questions, but they'll deal with like more, maybe within a study, there's a conflict, or maybe something to do, maybe study is ongoing and something happens with a patient and they need to advise. So they deal with policy. Maybe they work on NIH policies for bioethics. They help us obviously with review. So they do, in fact, their role is even broader than the IRB, which just approves the protocol. Any questions that come up, they do research, they write papers, sharing of data with patients. So their role is a little bit more broader and, very interesting. So IRB, very, very specific. Bioethics group or core, maybe different names of offices. NHGRI have our own bioethics team, and they help us, and they, I think, answer various questions. So I'm not sure if it answers it, but I can guarantee that, you will hear a little bit more, hopefully next week about it.
Yes, and I can add from my own experience because before coming to PAHO, I used to work at the Department of Bioethics at NIH, where I was doing research on bioethics primarily. But of course, every bioethics researcher, and I'm talking about someone who does research on bioethics, as opposed to a scientist that checks that their research is ethical. So as a bioethics researcher, you investigate how should we handle these things in the future? What are the problems? How could we do better? What's the right thing in these situations in which that some of you have brought to the discussion, where it's really not clear that we know very well what the right thing to do, or we know what we ought to do, but we're not sure whether what we ought to do based on moral reasoning should be captured by a legal instrument or a legal requirement. And that's I think that we have to be aware that this is an area on which there's still a lot of conceptual work to be done. And some of that work also relates to some of the challenges that Carlos brought to the discussion about, well, the technology now, I mean, it's increasingly easier to de-identify data that we would have said before was unidentifiable. So how do we handle that in the best way? So there was a question that relates to something that Sarah alluded to, and it has to do with. So you've talked about your role from the perspective of NIH, but these are contracts between two institutions. Do you deal with other institutions that are based on other countries that may not have a regulation that's similar to the policies that you have at NIH? What's the experience from the other side for those people dealing with NIH in institutions based in other countries in the world? And I'm just gonna add something else that's in another question about genetic, about the Nagoya Protocol and the genetic patrimony, but I don't think that's the right term. But I think I should just. Nagoya Protocol on its own does the work. How do you handle that in the MTAs discussions?
Thank you. So so you're right. Not all the countries and not even all organizations have the same regulations in place. So when we hear from other organizations that maybe don't have an MTA in place, we always offer to use our templates. So we'll say, I think we've done something similar where another country, a university hospital wanted to send us human samples, and they said, we don't have anything in place, like we don't have an agreement, what do you do? So, technically, we're not even required to use an agreement to receive something. Honestly, if you receive something without anything written, you can do whatever you want with it, frankly, right? There's nothing written down. But for human materials, because we want to be careful, we want something written down. So we we often use ours. We'll just say, we're going to take our template, switch provider and recipients, just flip the roles, and we use it, and we're happy to do it because, if we're asking you to agree to it, we agree to it. So oftentimes we will provide our own templates. And that's what we say. We say it's up to the provider, since it's your materials, you own it, it's up to you. Do you want something written down? We recommend we have something. So we leave it a little bit to them, but we're happy just to use our template saying, yeah, it says NIH, but we just flip provider recipient. So I think that's what we've seen. We have seen rarely, but sometimes we see, actually just saw some agreements, foreign, that say, this is our policy, this is our actually country law, and it's non-negotiable. And that becomes very difficult. Once you hear something non-negotiable, probably what their template is based on their country's law, we cannot accept, because maybe it'll say the laws of this country apply only, and it's not US law, and we can't accept it. So there are some difficult things where it says non-negotiable. So same here, if you're setting something up, everything's, I don't know, at least on our side, everything is and should be negotiable, because each situation is a little bit different. If you establish something and say, this is the end, it's difficult. So we have one of those agreements sitting in our Office of General Counsel for all of HHS, and they're very busy, and it's going to take a long time for them to review, because they said non-negotiable. Can you agree to it or no? Like, they have to override and authorize and all these things. So I think that's maybe one advice. Like, if you do set up something, just try not to say it's non-negotiable, because then it can create difficulties. You never know, like, what you may need to negotiate. I think that's actually the most difficult thing we've seen. Otherwise, we're flexible. We said we can sign something super simple. So honestly, sometimes maybe we will even, like, for example, the governing law. So our standard clauses, U.S. law in the District of Columbia, in the federal courts. But you know what? If you really can't agree, if we're negotiating with England and they only want to use English law, maybe we don't use it at all. Like, we don't say anything. Honestly, we can remain silent, and that's the compromise. We don't say what it is, and if in the future something happens, we'll, like, the attorney, that's acceptable. So so that sort of thing. And actually, we never, so I will say we never deal with the Nagoya Protocol, because I'm not so sure we're the party to whether we renewed our Nagoya Protocol membership. It's a little bit above my pay grade, like who decides. So we've never seen anything related, at least in our office, I will say. International things kind of depends. We try to be flexible. We try to offer our templates, but yeah, just the worst thing I think we've seen when people say non-negotiable, the end, take it or leave it. Well, we want to have a relationship. Why take it or leave it? Like, everything's negotiable. That's the best I can say, maybe.
Thank you. The word that I was seeking for patrimonio is resources, genetic resources, and I have been at some international meetings on MTAs. I'm just thinking about one organized by Georgetown University, when there's been discussions of the Nagoya Protocol that it's about biological diversity. So it's not obviously seen in some jurisdictions like the US as the obvious guidance for MTAs, but it's seen as the guidance for other for topics that do pertain directly to biological diversity. But I have learned that that's, I mean, in countries where you do not have more specific guidance for human research, and you look at the international instruments that are out there, I've seen that the Nagoya Protocol is being invoked as providing guidance for research-related topics. So one question that I think was either directed to me directly or was in the chat, I guess, was related to the role of biobanking. So biobanks versus just plain use of MTAs. Can you clarify whether how do those relate? I don't want to preempt the answer with a question.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. So biobanks, or we sometimes call them repositories. So as long as it's allowed, again, by the protocol, the consents and all that, we do encourage use of repositories, because one of NIH's policies is to distribute research materials as broadly as possible. Once you publish on something, we want to spread it out. So NIH and various institutes actually have contracts with some repositories. One of them is called Coriell with a C in English, Coriell, that store different cell lines and then distribute them both to NIH and outside. So we do work with, we deposit our materials in various, we call them maybe repositories. And Corriel is a common one because they're actually a contractor, I think, of NIH. So they have some relationship with us, and there are different ones. But we do encourage it. Again, for human samples, it can be a little bit tricky because they're now, once you immortalize a cell line, maybe you're modify it and do other things, it becomes a little bit like further removed from the donor. So it's a little bit easier, but we have to be careful. So we encourage use if possible. In our institute, we don't deposit so much because the samples are usually kind of rare disease related or straight from the patient, and they're sending them for analysis or diagnosis. But it is encouraged, and we do use repositories, as we call them. So, but then the agreement is the repository has an agreement for deposition, and we have to make sure that it's in line with, if we want to deposit, maybe we add some terms to it or something. I think in fact, we're just trying to deposit something now, and we say, we want to add the term about not re-identifying the donor, by the way, like we want to add it in there too. So we do use them, we encourage them, but again, for human materials, it can be a little tricky, depending what you use to create it with. And I hate to add, induced pluripotent stem cells present a even more like delicate situation, how you create them, what materials you use, you can create so many cells from them. So it's a little trickier. Like it's easier to deposit, antibodies or plasmids. Addgene is a fantastic repository for plasmids for research purposes. Human materials trickier, but it's possible for cell lines, especially, I'd say.
Thank you. So there's another question about the use of specimens disclosure in the informed consent form, the more clause that you've indirectly referred to in your presentation. But if you could clarify how that's handled by NIH in the context of MTAs.
Yeah, so each consent form has a specific, at least the modern consent forms, because I think there's a little bit of a problem with older consent forms, but modern ones usually have a section that says future use of your data and materials. And I think there is standardized language now used. And again, it's a little bit more on the bioethics side to review, but I know that, when we send the consent, maybe we'll highlight, please look on page 3, there's a whole section saying what can or cannot be used. And I think, that Jeff will be able to speak to it more, but there is, in the past, I think that language was very restrictive. And now I think it's more permissible to tell the patient, this can be shared with other investigators for related purposes. Maybe your samples will be used for commercial purposes, which would allow for licensing. So this language, there's a whole section that the patient, supposed to read and sign. That is, I think it's becoming more and more permissive of like how we can use it. So I hope that's the question. And again, we don't review it in great detail, but I do know that section should address things like we may create iPSC cells, induced pluripotent stem cells from your samples. We may want to share it with researchers. We may want to share it with companies. All of that, there is some standard language that IRB and bioethics reviews and approves. I'm not as familiar with it, but it's definitely a section in each consent. That's what we look for when it comes to transfers.
Thank you, Ana. I have so many questions, but I want to say, Carlos, Sarah, feel free to jump in if you want to chime in or ask another question or share anything from the perspective of the region. So there was a question about, you mentioned SLAs and MTAs. So this kind of relates to the previous topic, the non-commercial use for SLAs. I don't know if you could elaborate a bit more about that distinction, since there's a question about that.
So SLA is a simple letter agreement. It's usually something like 1 page and has very, very few terms. It's really used to sort of memorialize what you're transferring. And the reason I say we don't like to send things under it, because it's almost too simple. I mean, I don't want to be all lawyerly and say like complicated is better. Like, simple is good, but sometimes it's too simple. So for human materials, this thing, SLA would probably say, we're transferring this maybe there's a research purpose, maybe it doesn't have to. We're transferring this cell line to you. Very, very few restrictions, and it's just kind of memorialized. So it is, but now we're happy to use it for, something like maybe plasmids, maybe antibodies. Things are not super proprietary. So it's perfectly good to use, just so you say, oh, I just want a record, like, so in the future, someone asks me, where did we send these antibody? I don't know. Oh, here it is. So it's very common as simple letter agreement. I think maybe if you even look at online, a lot of places use it. But once it comes to nuanced materials, human materials, animals, there isn't enough there to cover that. We'd have to be adding stuff in and add this. And, so it depends on the material. That's why I said if it's something not super proprietary, we don't even maybe use it, but we don't like to use it too much. It's very, very just like a record of transfer, which is good. You have something that tells you what happened, where you sent it. But you can probably look it up, like, if you put in search for simple letter agreement, I think it's pretty common.
Thank you so much. So I'm thinking we have 15 minutes left, and we have to wrap up. It's been incredibly rich, and it seems, I feel like we're going through a little bit of an accordion issue, right? We started this as if it'd be like one simple thing, and then it's like the accord, it started opening up, and we see it comes in so many different flavors, and there's so many subtleties that, and including like so many different agents, like for example, a tech transfer office really doesn't exist in the majority of our research institutions in the region. And I think that as we are transitioning to better research with better governance, we're all seeking into adhering to the highest ethical standards. And when we started last Tuesday, when we started this workshop, I started reminding everybody why we started talking about MTAs as part of the work of PAHO's regional program on bioethics, which is because SIOMs in the guidelines 11 and 12 on use of genetic material for and associated data and data for research mention MTAs as what we ought to do research ethically. And the last, that SIOM's document is from December 2016, and I feel like a lot has happened since then, but we're still grappling with the issue and trying to formalize many of the processes that we have to deal with to conduct research. And in many cases, and this is something that was discussed at the previous session, in many cases, I would say in the majority of cases in the region, we do not have any regulation that gets into the details that are needed. But the speaker last week reminded us about the importance of policy requirements. Well, if you're in a country that does not have any regulation to guide you on the issue, well, you can set up policy that adheres to the highest standards. And I see the questions, I think I see the comments in the chat, and I think that there's a lot of appetite for continuing doing this, because what we notice is that very often these documents are seen as merely bureaucratic in nature. And I think that I'm very happy with the discussion, because it's explaining what's importance that these documents have, and what from our different roles, what our duties are, taking into account our different roles to ensure that we proceed responsibly, ethically, that sample that was obtained for patient, from a research participant for specific role, that we are respectful to that, and that the research, that we advance research while honoring the wishes of those that are generously contributing to research, and at the same time minimizing other risks that can result from doing research without the proper care to these details. And as you said, Anna, we and this is something that I always repeat. I think we mentioned this last week too. Research is in an institution that is to a great deal based on trust, and this is we strengthen all the components. We include regulation when it's needed, but if you really think about what actually happens, there's a lot of trust that is invoked in a number of components in the process, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we have to make sure that we balance trust with responsibility, that we advance responsible trust, as it were, and that invoking trust is not an excuse for like, oh yeah, well, assume things will be fine all the time. I mean, that it's not a justification for negligence. So I think that's an important reminder for us as we really move forward and in the region. And one of the questions that we will be asking ourselves in the final, in the fourth session of this workshop is also what should the legal landscape look like? What should the future look like as we move forward? Because I think we're also very aware that we tend to sometimes over-regulate in the hope that because something is an illegal instrument, it'll be followed in all cases. And we all know that's it's not like that. And one message that PAHO's regional program of bioethics constantly emphasizes on is that research, to be ethical, has to be approached as a system. We need the regulation, we need the training of the investigators, we need the training of the committees, we need, we need transparency, we need we need a number of things in place. And every time we think that there's one magic one that will solve all the problems, we will fail. So I think it's we're very lucky to have this space that brings together experts like you, like Carlos, like Sarah, so many members of committees, researchers, and also health authorities that are really very committed to strengthening the governance of research, and especially research with human subjects in our region. So I don't know, I'm gonna, I don't know if Sarah, Carlos, and Anna, if you have any final reflection to share with our audience.
I can just start, but well, thank you for inviting me. I just want to say that whether it's me and we have the tech transfer community, I will say, is very collegial and very open to questions, and everyone's always happy to help. So what within the institute, outside. So if you have any further questions, feel free to contact me. I can put you in touch with other people at NIH who may have a better answer to what you're asking. I do want to say, if you want to meet more people or sort of network in that area, that organization AUTM, AUTM, has an annual meeting in the US every year that brings in tech transfer from all over the world. Really, it's an international meeting. So if you wanted to maybe get more information or meet more people, next one is in February in San Diego, California. But AUTM really has a, maybe it's more applicable because it has both university and government organization, but I think it's a great place to meet more people, ask questions in person. Now these meetings are in person. So, but for me, like I said, if you have questions, please feel free to email me, and I can always put you in touch again with someone else. Maybe that's not a question for me. Maybe I know someone better. It's a really nice collegial community. And as you've seen, tech transfer brings people with like all kinds of degrees, whether it's doctorates, medical doctors, PhDs, lawyers, business people. It is a really nice community that, is helpful. And does encompass a lot of areas, and brings in a lot of areas. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ana. Carlos.
Bueno, de mi parte, nuevamente un
Well,
agradecimiento.
as far as I'm concerned, once again, thank you, Anna, for your presentation. Thank you, Carla, for organizing this very important workshop series developed with PAHO. Sarah, as usual, it's a pleasure to always have you as a panelist. And I would like to conclude with some interesting remarks. During this meeting, we talked a lot about trust as one of the basic rules in research. And I saw that in one of the questions or comments from the audience, there was a lot of emphasis on education. So, Carla, like you very well said, in addition to having regulation and that we have to abide by certain legal requirements, it's very important to have researchers that think that it's unthinkable to go against these principles. That is to say that all this becomes part of their personal values and they don't need any kind of rules or regulations to do their work ethically. I believe this is something that we need to start working on. It's not easy, but I think it's key. And on the other hand, like Carla very well said, we are addressing this issue in a way to try to make it less bureaucratic. You tend to associate agreements and arrangements as a bureaucratic thing. And what we're trying to highlight in these meetings is how it can intersect with ethical aspects. And like Anna said, not being rigid, but rather more flexible, to be willing to negotiate. Anna was saying that we should make a difference between old informed consent forms and current ones, how they have evolved and how certain concepts have changed. Obviously, always being very cautious and being good stewards of information, but also highlighting how important it is to safeguard information and biological material for research purposes. So we are constantly moving forward and trying to pave the way and build this bridge between our old way of doing things and this more current one that advocates for the rights of the people and the wishes of our participants. Thank you very much. I will continue to join the rest of the sessions because this is great. Thank you, Carlos. Sarah, any final remarks? Yes, I wanted to say that actually this workshop will be very useful because it's like we opened the door to this issue from our previous session. In our previous sessions, we talked about institutional policies and basic notions, and today we saw that these institutional policies are implemented through this one office that is a technology transfer office, but that office doesn't work by itself or in isolation, but rather that it's in contact with all of the other players. And something very important, and that will be developed over the course of the next sessions, is the role that each one plays, especially ethics committees, because apparently in the region, when something has to be done ethically, the committee is the one that is upheld to that responsibility, and it shouldn't necessarily be like that. So we continue to analyze this, and I think this is great because it also educates researchers and ethics committee members on how to do things and what we should be doing in our institutions, in our countries, to make sure that these data and sample transfer agreements are implemented so that we can work ethically in the region. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of you who made this activity possible. Silvina Costa, who has been in charge, Marcy Neal and Nam Fong, who recorded in a session, and our interpreters who made it possible for us to hold this workshop in 2 languages. Thank you very much, and we will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.